The gun was already pressed against Graham Monroe's temple when Alma Baker opened her front door. She stood in the frame of that weathered oak door, lantern light spilling gold across her dark hair, her brown eyes going wide and wild as a startled mare, and the man holding the revolver to Graham's skull grinned like the devil himself had taught him how to smile. "Evening, Alma," said Cole Briggs, her brother, her blood, her most terrible secret. "Brought you a lawman. Thought you might want to say goodbye before I put him in the ground." Graham Monroe, Deputy United States Marshal out of Abilene, Kansas, with a badge that had seen 3 years of dust and gunpowder and hard prairie wind, looked at the woman in the doorway and felt something shift deep inside his chest. He had followed Cole Briggs's trail across 4 counties, through 2 river crossings, past a burned-out homestead and a robbed stagecoach relay station, and that trail had led him here to this woman's door, to this moment that was either the end of his life or the beginning of something he could not yet name. "Ma'am," he said, calm as a man who was not staring down the dark mouth of death, "I apologize for arriving at this hour." Alma Baker did not flinch. She looked at her brother, and whatever passed between them in that look was so loaded with old pain, old loyalty, and the unbearable weight of hidden truths that Graham felt like an intruder in someone else's grief. Then she looked at Graham again, and something in her face settled into a decision. "Cole," she said quietly, "put the gun down." Cole Briggs laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "You protecting a lawman now, little sister. You know what he'll do if I let him go. He'll drag me back to Abilene in chains. He'll see me hang." "Then let him go and run," Alma said. "But you will not kill a man on my doorstep." The forced choice hung in the air between all 3 of them like smoke after a shot fired. The night was enormous and black around the small circle of lantern light, the Kansas prairie stretching out in every direction, indifferent and vast. Crickets sang. A horse shifted in the corral. And Cole Briggs, who had robbed a bank in Dodge City and killed a man named Arthur Hensley during the robbery, and who had been running from justice for 11 days, slowly lowered the revolver. He looked at his sister one long moment. His face, younger than Graham expected for a man with such a brutal reputation, was complicated with something that was not quite remorse and not quite defiance, but lived in the terrible space between those 2 things. Then Cole Briggs turned and ran into the dark. Graham Monroe exhaled. Alma Baker looked at the man standing on her porch, his wrists still bound behind him with Cole's rope, blood from a cut above his eyebrow dried dark against his temple, wearing a duster that had seen better days and a badge that caught the lantern light and threw it back, and she said, "You had better come inside." He had first heard the name Cole Briggs 3 weeks earlier, in the Marshal's Service office in Abilene, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of tobacco and old paper, and the particular staleness of authority that has been exercised too long in too small a space. Marshal Theodore Hicks, 60 years old and built like a fence post that had survived too many storms, had spread a wanted poster across the desk with the flat of his broad hand and said, 22 years old. Bank robbery, 1 count of murder in the 1st degree, armed with a Colt single-action army, considered extremely dangerous. Last seen heading south from Dodge City. You'll ride after him, Monroe. Graham had looked at the poster. Cole Briggs's face stared back at him, encrendered and flat, but the eyes even in the crude engraving held something restless and cornered. A young man who had made a catastrophic choice and now could not unmake it. "Alone?" Graham asked. "Deputy Carruthers is still laid up with that shoulder," Hicks said. "And I won't spare 2 men for 1 outlaw. You're my best tracker. Go." So Graham had gone. He was 30 years old that autumn of 1882, lean and brown from the sun, with dark eyes that had learned to be patient and hands that had learned to be steady. He had been a lawman for 6 years, having come to it after 2 years of cattle driving, and 1 disastrous attempt at farming a quarter section of land in Nebraska that the grasshoppers had eaten down to nothing in the summer of 1876. The law suited him. It gave his natural quietness a purpose. It gave his stubbornness somewhere useful to direct itself. He had picked up Cole Briggs's trail south of Dodge City without much difficulty. A young man alone on a dark horse, asking too few questions and paying for things too quickly, left a particular kind of mark on the memory of the people he passed. A livery keeper in Cimarron. A woman who ran a boarding house in Liberal who said the young man had not slept, had paced all night, had left before first light. A farmer northeast of Ashland who had seen a rider moving fast across his wheat field, cutting toward the open range. The trail wound south and east, and Graham followed it with the methodical patience that was his particular gift, and on the 11th day he had tracked Cole Briggs to a small farm just outside a town called Mercer, Kansas, a town so small it consisted of a general store, a church, a blacksmith, and the stubborn optimism of the people who had decided to live there. He had not expected Cole Briggs to be waiting for him. He should have. A cornered man who has stopped running has generally decided to fight. Graham had come up on the farmhouse in the last light of afternoon, moving carefully through the stand of cottonwood trees along the creek, and Cole Briggs had dropped on him from a low branch like something feral and furious, and they had struggled in the creek mud while the horses plunged and scattered. And when it was over, Graham had lost his gun and Cole had his hands bound and was on horseback in front of Cole with the revolver at his head, riding toward the farmhouse. And the woman at the door had been the last thing he expected to find at the end of that violent and exhausting trail. Alma Baker cut the rope from his wrists with a kitchen knife, matter-of-fact and efficient, and she poured water into a basin and set it on the table with a cloth, and she said, "Sit down, Marshal, before you fall down." "Deputy Marshal," he said, and sat. She cleaned the cut above his eyebrow with a gentleness that contradicted the brisk economy of her movements. She was 26 years old, he would later learn, and she had been living alone on this farm for 2 years, since her husband Martin Baker had died of a fever that had swept through the county in the summer of 1880. She had stayed because the land was hers and she had worked it, and she would not surrender it to grief. She had 160 acres under the Homestead Act, a kitchen garden, a small herd of dairy cows, a dozen chickens, and a stubbornness that ran bone deep. She was also, he was discovering, the sister of a wanted outlaw, which complicated her situation considerably. "I need to tell you something," she said, pressing the cloth to the cut with a precise, careful pressure that made him very aware of how close she was standing. "Cole did not plan to kill that man in Dodge City. He told me what happened. The bank teller reached for a shotgun and Cole panicked and fired before he could think. I am not asking you to excuse it, but I am telling you it was not cold-blooded murder." "A man is still dead," Graham said. "Yes," she said. "A man is still dead, and my brother has to answer for that, I know it." She pulled the cloth back and inspected the cut with clinical detachment. "I told him to turn himself in. I told him that the first time he came here 4 days ago, he would not listen." "He came here 4 days ago," Graham repeated. She met his eyes. Hers were dark brown, almost black in the lamplight, and they held the kind of directness that some people find uncomfortable and Graham found extraordinary. "Yes. I did not send word to the marshals because he is my brother and I am a coward about the people I love. That is my sin and I will own it. But I did not help him run further. I fed him and I argued with him and I told him what I believe, which is that running will only make things worse, and then he left and I thought he was gone, and then tonight he came back with you." Graham was quiet for a moment. The lamp flickered. Outside, the prairie night was enormous and still. "Where do you think he'll go now?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "He has no money left. He knows no one in this territory except me. He is frightened and exhausted, and he is trying to protect me by staying away from me, and that is possibly the only sensible thing he has done in the last 2 weeks." She stepped back from him and rinsed the cloth in the basin, and the water turned pink. "You're welcome to rest here tonight and continue your pursuit in the morning. Your horses are in my corral. I can see to them." "I can see to the horses," he said, standing, and then stopped because the room tilted slightly and he had to grip the table edge. "Sit down," she said again, and this time there was something softer underneath the firmness of it. He sat. She made coffee. She heated a pot of yesterday's stew. She set bread on the table, a loaf she had baked that morning, and the smell of it was so ordinary and so domestic in the aftermath of ropes and revolvers, and the cold edge of almost dying that Graham found himself having to breathe carefully for a moment just to locate himself in the world again. He watched her move around the kitchen. She moved like someone who was very comfortable in her own space, with no performance in it, no self-consciousness, just the clean efficiency of a person who knew where everything was and what everything was for. The kitchen was small but immaculate, the shelves holding their tins and jars with a kind of careful order that spoke of a woman who valued control over the things she could control because so much of life was not controllable at all. "How long have you been out here alone?" he asked. She poured coffee into a tin cup and set it in front of him. 2 years. Martin died in August of 1880. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said, and it was genuine and not performative. She sat down across from him with her own cup. He was a good man. Not a dramatic man, not a man full of large gestures, but a good steady man who kept his word and did his work. "I miss him mostly in the practical ways, which I suppose sounds cold, but I think it is actually the deepest kind of missing. You miss the ordinary presence of someone, the way they handed you things, the sound of them in the next room." Graham thought about that. He had not had that kind of presence in his life, not the way she described it. He had been alone more years than not, since his mother died when he was 16 and his father had taken to drinking, and the farm in Missouri had gone to seed. He had never been married. There had been a woman in Abilene briefly, a schoolteacher named Clara who had wanted him to stop being a lawman and become something stationary, and he had been unable to promise that. And so Clara had married a dry goods merchant, and Graham had not been surprised and had not allowed himself to be more than quietly sad about it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to whether I permit it or not," she said, with a faint dryness that was, he realized, a kind of humor. "How did Cole end up?" He stopped, trying to find the least cruel phrasing. "How did my brother become an outlaw?" she said flatly. "You can say it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Cole is 8 years younger than me. He was 14 when Martin and I came out here. Our parents were dead, he had no one else, so we brought him. He grew up on this land in this house, and he was a good boy, a genuinely good boy, curious and funny and kind to animals. And then he turned 19 and the drought came and the bank called in the note on the Whitaker farm next to ours. And the Whitakers, who were our closest neighbors, the Whitaker family, their eldest boy Tom was Cole's best friend. They lost everything. They had to leave. And Cole never." She stopped. The lamp flickered again. Outside something moved, a nighthawk cutting across the dark, its cry strange and thin. "He never got over watching that happen to people he loved," she said. "He got angry in a way he couldn't find an outlet for. And then he met some men in town who were angry the same way, and they had outlets that were criminal, and I watched it happen, and I talked to him, and I prayed over it, and I couldn't stop it." Graham was quiet. He understood the shape of that story. He had seen it before in other young men, that particular combination of genuine injustice and insufficient wisdom that led to terrible choices. "What happens to him if you catch him?" she asked. "Trial in Abilene," Graham said. "The robbery charge is certain." Murder charge, he thought about it honestly because she deserved honesty. If it can be argued as unpremeditated as a shooting in a panic rather than a killing with intent, a good lawyer might get it reduced to manslaughter. But I won't lie to you, the sentence would still be serious. Several years at minimum, possibly Leavenworth. She absorbed this. Her face did not crumple, but something behind it shifted like ground settling after rain. "He's 22 years old," she said. "I know," Graham said. They sat in silence for a moment that was surprisingly not uncomfortable, given everything that surrounded it. The coffee was strong and good. The stew, when he ate it, was better than anything he had eaten in 11 days on the trail. "You track people for a living," she said eventually. "Yes." "Do you ever," she seemed to be choosing her words carefully, Do you ever think about whether the law is always right, about whether the things it protects are always worth protecting? It was not a naive question. He could hear in it a woman who had been thinking about injustice since long before her brother had become a criminal, who had been watching the land she loved be shaped by forces that did not care about the people who lived on it. Yes, he said honestly, all the time, but I also think about Arthur Hensley's family. He had a wife, 2 children. He was 28 years old. He set down his spoon. I can hold both things at once. Your brother's bad situation and the fact that he made a terrible choice inside it. I don't need it to be simple. She looked at him for a long moment. Most men I've met need it to be simple, she said. Most men I've met need it to be simple too, he said. I find it exhausting. And there it was, that tiny unexpected thread of humor in the dark, and she almost smiled. And Graham felt something he had not felt in a long time, maybe never felt quite this specifically, which was the sensation of being seen by someone who was not trying to see what they expected to see, but was simply looking at what was actually there. He slept in the barn that night, which was more comfortable than it sounds. The hay was fresh, the horses were settled, and he was tired enough that the hard ground under the hay felt like luxury. But he lay awake for a while staring at the barn roof and thinking about Alma Baker, about the particular courage it took to face your brother across the barrel of a gun and tell him to put it down, about the kind of woman who stayed alone on a Kansas prairie for 2 years because the land was hers and she had decided so. In the morning she made eggs and biscuits, and they ate together without ceremony. And she told him about the farm, about how she managed it, about the challenges of the second year when the corn had come up thin due to insufficient rain, about how she had supplemented her income by taking in laundry from the town of Mercer, and by selling her butter and eggs at the general store, about her plans for expanding the kitchen garden next spring. He noticed that she told him all of this without any apology or diminishment, not as someone cataloging hardships for sympathy, but as someone reporting on their work with the pride of competence. "What made you become a lawman?" she asked. He thought about the various true answers to that question and chose the truest one. "Because I was good at following things and I didn't want to watch the country get sorted into people with power and people without it and do nothing about it. The law isn't perfect, but it's a lever. If you're in the right position, you can use it to push back sometimes." She was quiet, considering this. Cole would say the law is just another way for the powerful to protect what they took. "Cole is not entirely wrong," Graham said. "But he's also standing at the bottom of a well looking up at a circle of sky and thinking that's the whole world." She looked at him sharply, and he thought for a moment he had gone too far, that the criticism of her brother would close something between them. But then she said slowly, "That's almost exactly what I said to him, not in those words, but that." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the east window, and something was happening between them that neither of them had invited or expected, something that was growing in the way things grow in Kansas, quietly and stubbornly, and with a great deal of hidden work happening underground. "I need to try to find him," Graham said. "I know," she said. He rode out mid-morning, having borrowed a more detailed map of the territory from her. She had one the county land office had issued when she filed her homestead claim, and she had marked the places on it where Cole knew people or where he had mentioned going. 2 names. A former ranch hand named Dupree who lived 12 miles east, and an abandoned hunting cabin near the Cimarron River where Cole had once spent a summer trapping. He found Cole Briggs at the hunting cabin 2 days later, and unlike the first encounter, Cole did not fight. He was sitting on the ground outside the cabin door, elbows on his knees, staring at the river, and when Graham rode up he looked at him with eyes so exhausted they had gone past fear into something gray and flat and bottomless. "I know," Cole said. "I know." Graham stepped down from his horse. He kept his hand near his holster, but he did not draw. "Are you going to give me trouble?" he asked. Cole shook his head. "Alma told me," he said. "Before I rode away, she said running is a trap." She said I'd spend the rest of my life in a smaller and smaller cage if I kept running, that the only way out was through. She said he stopped. His voice had gone rough. She said she couldn't help me if I was gone, but she could if I was alive and present and willing to face it. Graham sat down beside him on the ground, which was an unusual thing for a lawman to do with an outlaw he was about to arrest, but it felt like the right thing. The river moved past them, brown and quiet. She gave me a name, Graham said. A lawyer in Abilene, John Strathmore. He's good. He's handled cases like this before. Cole turned to look at him. Why are you telling me that? Graham considered the question. Because she loves you, he said finally. And because you're 22 years old and you made a terrible choice inside a bad situation, and I would rather you end up in Leavenworth for 5 years than dead in a ditch before your 23rd birthday. The law is not supposed to be about erasure. It's supposed to be about consequence and correction. He paused. Though it often falls short of that intention. Cole laughed, a short, surprised sound. Alma said you were an unusual man. Graham went very still. She said that. She sent word through Dupree when you went past his place, Cole said. She knew you'd find me. He looked at the river again. She said tell Cole the deputy marshal is a man worth trusting. Tell him to go home to me. The word home landed between them like something dropped from a great height. Graham brought Cole Briggs back to Mercer that evening, riding ahead with Cole beside him, hands bound before him, a concession to dignity that Graham had offered without being asked. And when they came up the track to the farmhouse, Alma Baker was standing on the porch, and she did not run to her brother. She stood still, but her face did something enormous and uncontrolled that Graham looked away from because it felt private. Cole said, Alma. And she said, I know. And then, come inside, both of you. You both look half dead. They stayed 2 nights at the farm before Graham's obligation required him to move Cole toward Abilene for processing. In that time, something happened that was outside the jurisdiction of laws or obligations, or any sensible plan for how Graham Monroe's life was supposed to go. On the first evening, Cole slept early, exhausted past endurance, and Graham found himself sitting on the porch steps with Alma while the sun went down over the Kansas prairie in colors so excessive and so beautiful that they seemed almost argumentative, as if the sky were insisting on its own magnificence regardless of what small human dramas were being enacted beneath it. They talked for 2 hours. About farming and law and justice, and the particular experience of watching someone you love make choices you can't control. About the way the land changed between seasons, how the prairie was not dull to someone who knew how to read it. About books, she read voraciously. She had a shelf of them in the bedroom. She told him about the novels she had worked through in the 2 winters since Martin died, Dickens and George Eliot, and a battered collection of Whitman's poems that she returned to constantly. He had not talked like this in years. He had not realized how much he had missed it, the particular kind of talking that is not about anything practical but about the interior of things, about what you believe and why, and what confuses you, and what you find beautiful. On the second evening, Cole had gone inside after supper, and Alma and Graham were washing up the dishes, standing side by side at the basin, and she handed him a plate to dry, and their hands brushed. Nothing dramatic, the most ordinary contact, and they both went still for a moment that stretched like taffy, sweet and slow and impossible to break quickly. You'll ride out tomorrow, she said. In the morning, he said. I have to. Cole needs to be in Abilene before the end of the month for the court calendar. I know, she said. She took back the dried plate and put it on the shelf with the careful precision she brought to everything. I want to ask you something that you don't have to answer. All right. She turned to face him. They were very close in the small kitchen, the lamplight between them, and her eyes were direct and serious, and there was a vulnerability in them that he suspected she did not often allow anyone to see. Do you think he'll be all right? She asked, and her voice was controlled, but he could hear what was underneath it, the fear that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. I think, Graham said carefully, that he has a good lawyer, a willing disposition to cooperate, a genuine case to be made for reduced charges, and a sister who will write him letters and fight like hell for him from the outside. I think his odds are better than they were a week ago." He paused. "And I think I will make sure the marshal's office understands the full context of what happened, that the killing was not premeditated, that Cole Briggs turned himself involuntarily." She was quiet. "Then you didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "Why?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Because it's the truth," he said, "and because the truth matters more to me than a tidy narrative." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his face just briefly, the tips of her fingers against his jaw, a touch that lasted less than 3 seconds and said more than several speeches could have. He did not move. He stood very still and let himself feel the extraordinary significance of that small, deliberate gesture. "You are going to Abilene with my brother tomorrow," she said quietly, drawing her hand back. "Yes. And after that?" He thought about the honest answer. "After that I have no particular plan that I couldn't revise," he said. Something shifted in her expression, a very slight softening, a cautious warmth. "Mercer is a small town," she said. "It lacks a great many things, but it does not have a lawman." She turned back to the basin. "I mention this as a matter of factual record, not as anything else." "I understand," Graham said, and understood entirely. The morning ride to Abilene took 3 days, and Graham spent much of it in a state of internal recalibration that he recognized as unusual for him. He was not a man given to romantic preoccupation. He was methodical. He was practical. He directed his attention toward what was in front of him and not toward abstracted possibilities. But Alma Baker was not an abstracted possibility. She was a specific and real person who had cut the ropes from his wrists with a kitchen knife, and cleaned his wound with extraordinary gentleness, and argued with him about justice across a kitchen table, and touched his face in the lamplight in a way that had rearranged something essential in his understanding of himself. Cole Briggs rode beside him, and did not ask questions but watched Graham with a sidelong attention that suggested he was drawing his own conclusions. "On the second night, camped beside a creek," Cole said, "she hasn't shown interest in anyone since Martin died." Graham added a branch to the fire and said nothing. "I'm not saying it as a warning," Cole said. "I'm saying it as information." "Noted," Graham said. Cole was quiet for a moment. "She stayed after Martin died. Everyone expected her to go back east to our aunt in Cincinnati, and she stayed. Because the land was hers and she'd worked it, and she wasn't going to let grief take from her what she'd built." He looked at the fire. "She's the strongest person I know. I've made her life very hard these last months, and I know it." He stopped. "She knows," Graham said. "I know she knows." "That doesn't make it easier to live with." "No," Graham said. "Accountability rarely feels like relief at first. It mostly just feels like weight." He stirred the fire with a stick. "But it gets lighter if you carry it honestly." Cole looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I've been wrong before," Graham said, "and I had to sit with it." In Abilene, he turned Cole over to the marshal's office with a full written account of the circumstances of the arrest, the voluntary surrender, and his own assessment of the nature of the shooting in Dodge City. He sat for an hour with Marshal Hicks and laid out the case for the reduced charge with a thoroughness that surprised the older man. "You're awfully concerned about this boy's welfare," Hicks said, looking at Graham over the top of his spectacles. "I'm concerned about the truth of the matter," Graham said. "Which I've written out in full." "Hicks, the boy is 22 years old and he panicked. He didn't execute anyone. He fired in fear and a man died, which is a terrible thing, but it's a different crime than what the poster says." Hicks was quiet for a moment. "You also know this country has a habit of making examples," he said. "And a habit of making mistakes," Graham replied. "I'd like to try to prevent one of those." He found John Strathmore, the lawyer, at his office on 2nd Street and spent another hour there, laying out the same information. And Strathmore, a careful man with rimless spectacles and a meticulous mind, agreed that the case was workable. That evening, sitting in his rented room at the hotel, Graham Monroe wrote a letter. He had not written a letter for any personal reason in approximately 2 years, having kept all his communications strictly functional, case reports, and the occasional note to Hicks about equipment needs. He wrote 3 drafts of this one before he was satisfied, and even then it was not long. He told her that Cole had arrived safely, that Strathmore had agreed to take the case, that his own assessment had been formally filed with the marshal's office, that the preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out, that he had found in the course of the last week that his habitual solitude had revealed itself to him as what it actually was, which was loneliness that had gotten used to itself and forgotten its own name. He told her that Mercer lacked a lawman. He told her that he had given this some thought. He sent the letter. He waited 9 days, which was the time it took for a letter to reach Mercer and a reply to come back. And in those 9 days he was restless in a way that was entirely foreign to his nature. He took a case involving a stolen horse and found it resolved quickly and without satisfying action. He reorganized his equipment. He helped Hicks with paperwork. He was, by his own assessment, useless. The letter, when it came, was written in a hand that was precise and clear and characteristically without excessive ornamentation. She wrote that she was glad Cole had arrived safely, that she had already written to Strathmore herself with additional information about Cole's character and history, that she appreciated what he had done and was doing for her brother more than she knew how to say in formal language. Then she wrote, "I should tell you that I am not a dramatic person. I do not speak in large gestures or overstated feeling. But I find that I have been thinking, with considerable frequency and not inconsiderable disruption to my usual mental efficiency, about a conversation on a porch at sunset, and a kitchen with lamplight and a man who said the truth mattered more to him than a tidy narrative. I find that I would like to continue that conversation if the opportunity arose. Mercer does indeed lack a lawman." Graham read this letter 4 times, which for a man as economical as Graham Monroe was approximately the equivalent of another man reading it 40 times. He put in his notice with Hicks the following morning. Hicks looked at him for a long moment with the world-weary patience of a man who had watched many good deputies fall to the 2 inevitable vulnerabilities of a lawman's career, which were whiskey and women. "Is she worth it?" Hicks asked. Graham thought about this seriously, the way he thought about all serious things. Then he said, "I haven't given her the opportunity to be worth it yet, but she might be, and I've decided that finding out matters more to me than staying where I'm safe." Hicks regarded him for another moment. Then he shook his hand and wished him well and said to send word when he needed a reference. Graham Monroe rode out of Abilene on a cold Tuesday morning in early November of 1882, the prairie brown and wide under a white sky, the horse beneath him steady and patient, the saddlebags holding everything he owned, which was not much, a change of clothes, his guns, his badge which he no longer had an official post to wear it on, some books, a razor, and Alma Baker's letter folded twice in his breast pocket. He arrived in Mercer 3 days later, in the late afternoon, the town materializing out of the flat country with its small cluster of buildings and its enormous surrounding sky. And he stopped at the general store first because that seemed like the sensible thing to do, to understand the community before presenting himself as anything. The man behind the counter was a heavy-set man in his 50s named Garrett who had been running the store for 8 years and who, as it turned out, was also the closest thing Mercer had to a civic authority, the town having been incorporated only recently and still working out the details of its governance. Graham told him his background, his experience, his reason for being in the area. Garrett listened with the careful attention of a man who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly out of professional necessity. Then he said, "We've been needing someone since old Hendricks left last spring. We've got about 200 people in the county. Nothing too dramatic, but we've had some cattle theft and a bad situation with a group of men passing through last summer who got drunk and tore up the saloon and threatened the Mendez family over on the South Road." "I can handle that," Graham said. "Your reference, Marshal Theodore Hicks, Abilene, Graham said. I worked under him for 3 years. I can write to him for a formal reference or he can confirm by telegraph. Garrett nodded slowly. And your reason for landing in Mercer specifically? He asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who already had a suspicion and wanted to see if it would be confirmed. I know people in the area, Graham said. Garrett looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded again, this time with a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I expect Alma Baker might know you're coming. I expect she might, Graham said. He rode out to the farm as the sun was going down, the sky doing its extravagant thing again with the colors, orange and rose and a deep bruised purple at the edges, the prairie going gold in the last light. And he came up the track and Alma Baker was in the corral with her horses, not waiting on the porch for him, not performing any kind of arrival scene, just doing her evening work because the animals needed attending regardless of what was happening in her interior life. But she had seen him coming. He knew it because she turned to face him as he came through the gate, and her expression was not surprised. It was something else, a careful, quiet happiness that she was not suppressing but was not dramatizing either, and it was so perfectly her, that measured but genuine warmth, that he found himself smiling before he had fully stopped his horse. He stepped down. She was standing 10 feet away, her hair loose under her work hat, her hands dirty from the work, and she looked at him with those dark, direct eyes and said, "You actually came." "I said I would," he said. "You implied it," she corrected. "There is a difference." "I came," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I've got stew on the stove," and turned back toward the house, and he fell into step beside her. And that was how Graham Monroe came to Mercer, Kansas, without great ceremony and without dramatic declarations. Just 2 people walking together toward a lit house on a cold November evening with a great deal still unspoken between them, but the direction of it clear. He took a room at Garrett's boarding house in town and spent the first 2 weeks establishing himself in his new role as Mercer's deputy lawman, riding the county, calling on the farms and homesteads, making himself known as the man to come to with trouble. The work was quieter than Abilene, more intimate in its scale, and he found that he liked this better, the ability to know the people he was protecting, to understand the specific texture of their lives and what they needed from the law. He called on Alma Baker 3 times in those 2 weeks, and each time they talked longer and moved closer to something that was large and important, and that both of them were circling with the careful attention of people who had been hurt before and knew what it was to make irreversible choices. He learned more about her life, the daily reality of it, the 4 in the morning start and the work that didn't end, the particular loneliness of a winter evening in a house built for 2 people now containing only one, the way she had made herself sufficient by sheer will and intelligence, and had then had to sit with the question of whether sufficiency was the same as fullness. She learned more about him. He told her about Missouri, about his mother and father, about the failed farm and the cattle-driving years, and the slow discovery that he needed to be useful, that a life without usefulness felt to him like a life without substance. He told her about the grasshopper plague of 1876, about watching an entire year's labor vanish in 3 days, about the particular despair of that and the decision he made in its aftermath to stop trying to control what the land did and start trying to control what people did to each other, which was not controllable either, but at least you could sometimes intervene. She listened to all of this in her characteristic way, fully, without interruption, her attention complete and serious, and then she asked questions that went directly to the center of things, not the surface of what he had said but the meaning underneath it. On the 3rd visit, sitting at the kitchen table in the late afternoon with coffee between them and the cold November light slanting through the window, she said, "Graham." It was the first time she had used his name directly, and the specific sound of it in her voice did something to him that he was not going to be able to be calm about. "Yes," he said. "I want to be clear with you about something," she said, Because I am not good at ambiguity and I don't think you are either. I'm not, he agreed. I am interested in you, she said, directly and without performance, as more than a neighbor and more than a man who helped my brother. I am interested in you as a person, and I believe that what is happening between us is real and worth pursuing, and I would like to pursue it if you feel the same way. Graham set down his cup. He looked at her. He thought about the 11 days he had ridden across Kansas following a trail that had led him to this door, and about how the thing he had found here was nothing he had been sent to find and everything he had not known he was looking for. I feel the same way, he said. I feel it considerably. She smiled then fully, without the usual careful moderation, and it transformed her face entirely, and Graham Monroe understood in that moment that he was in a great deal of wonderful trouble. What followed was a courtship that matched the personalities of the people in it, thorough and serious, and infused with a happiness that neither of them had been in a hurry toward, and therefore valued all the more for having arrived at their own time. They rode together on Sundays, when Graham's duties allowed it, across the open country, and she taught him what she knew about reading the land, the way the grasses indicated moisture levels, the way bird behavior changed with the seasons, the way a prairie sky told you what was coming 3 hours before it arrived. He taught her what he knew about tracking, about reading the marks that living things left in the world, and she was, as he had expected, a swift and precise student. They talked constantly, in every available moment, and the talking was always interesting because they were genuinely interested in each other, not in the polished versions people present at the beginning of things, but in the actual complexity underneath, the doubts and frustrations and private theories about the world. And what they found as they went deeper was that their values were aligned in ways that were fundamental, and that their temperaments, though different in certain surface ways, she was more contained. He was more methodical, were compatible in the ways that mattered. In December, Cole Briggs's preliminary hearing took place in Abilene. Strathmore's work was careful, and the account Graham had filed carried weight. The charge was reduced from murder to involuntary manslaughter, which was as much as could be achieved given the facts. Cole was sentenced to 4 years at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. The letter from Strathmore with this news arrived on a Wednesday. Alma read it at the kitchen table with Graham sitting across from her, and her face went through several things in quick succession: grief for the years ahead, relief that it wasn't worse, love for her brother, and a complicated gratitude for the outcome. 4 years, she said quietly. With good behavior, possibly less, Graham said, and he knows that now. He's 22, she said again, as she had said that first night, and it was not a complaint against the law but a statement of sorrow about time, about how long 4 years was at 22. Yes, Graham said, and he'll be 26 when he comes out, still young, still with time to build something. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he wrote me. Before the hearing, he said he was glad you came after him. He said he thinks if you hadn't, he would have eventually done something worse, kept running until the situation became one where there was no way back. She folded the letter with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. He said you sat down beside him on the ground, which he said no lawman had ever done. Graham was quiet. Was that strategy? She asked. No, he said. She looked at him. What was it then? He was exhausted and frightened and 22 years old and sitting beside a river, Graham said. Standing over him seemed like the wrong shape for the moment. She reached across the table and took his hand, which she had not done before, and he turned his hand over under hers and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen while the winter wind moved against the windows. He proposed to her on a Sunday in late January of 1883, in the corral of all places, because that was where they were when the moment arrived, and he had learned from her that waiting for the perfect setting was a way of stalling what you already knew. She had been telling him about her plans for the spring planting, about the sorghum she wanted to try in the east field, about whether the irrigation channel could be extended, and he had been watching her face as she talked, animated and precise, entirely herself, and he had thought, "This is the person," and he had said so. He had not gone down on one knee. He was not a man for theatrics. He had simply turned to her and said, "Alma, I want to marry you. I want to live on this land with you and do work that matters and come home to you at the end of the day for the rest of my life. I want to know you for a very long time." She had gone still in the particular way she went still when something had hit the center of something in her. Then she said, "Yes." And then she said, "I want that too. I have wanted it for quite a while." And then she said, "You could have asked inside in the warm." "We were here," he said. "We were here," she agreed and laughed. And he pulled her to him there in the cold January corral with the horses watching and the Kansas sky enormous and white overhead. And they held each other for a long time without needing to say anything further because everything essential had been said. They were married in March of 1883 at the Mercer Church, which was small and wooden and cold, but had been decorated by the women of the community with what dried flowers could be found, and some calico fabric in a respectable approximation of festivity. Garrett stood up for Graham. A woman named Clara Ortiz, who had become Alma's closest friend in Mercer, stood up for Alma. The Reverend was a dry, efficient man who performed the ceremony without excessive embellishment, which suited both of them. And when Graham put the plain silver ring on Alma's finger, her hands were entirely steady, as he had expected they would be, because Alma Baker approached even the most emotionally overwhelming moments with the steady hands of someone who had decided. After, there was a small gathering at Garrett's store, because his was the largest space in Mercer, and there was cake and cider, and the community came out in the cold March afternoon and ate and talked and wished them well, and Graham Monroe stood in the middle of it all with his wife beside him, and felt the shape of his life change into something that he recognized as right. They moved his things to the farm that same week. The house that had been built for two was two again, and the quality of two that it held now was different from what it had held before. He brought order to the practical tasks she had been managing alone, not taking them over but distributing them more sensibly, and she let him reorganize the barn with the patience of someone who understood that a person needed to make themselves useful in a new space. He was careful about the things that were hers, the arrangement of her kitchen, her reading shelf, the way she kept her accounts, and she was careful about his autonomy, his need for quiet on certain evenings, his habit of riding out alone on Thursdays to think. They argued sometimes because two strong-minded people in a small house will, and the arguments were direct and not always comfortable, but they had the quality of arguments between people who trust each other, which is a very different thing from arguments between people who don't. They resolved them with the same directness they brought to everything, stating what they actually thought, listening to the response, moving toward the truth of the matter together. Spring came and the planting, and Graham found that the seasonal rhythm of the farm was something he had not known he needed. The cattle driving years had been all movement, one place to the next, and the lawman years had been all vigilance, the particular exhausting state of permanent alertness. This was different. This was a cycle. You put things in the ground and you tended them and they grew, and you harvested them and you put more things in the ground. And the rhythm of it was steadying in a way that was hard to articulate, but that he felt in his body as a lessening of the chronic tension he had been carrying for years. He still did his work as Mercer's lawman. The cattle theft problem was resolved. He tracked the responsible party, a man named Hardy who had been systematically taking calves from 3 homesteads over the winter, and the resolution was achieved without gunfire, which he considered the best kind of resolution. The Mendez family's situation improved after he made several formal visits to the men who had been harassing them, visits that were calibrated to make his intentions clear without provoking unnecessary escalation. He wrote to Cole at Leavenworth regularly, brief but genuine letters, and Cole wrote back. And in the letters, Cole was becoming something more than the frightened, exhausted young man Graham had sat beside at the river, was beginning to read more and think more carefully, was working in the prison library, was, it seemed, following his sister's advice and using the time to build something rather than simply endure it. In the summer of 1883, Alma told Graham she was pregnant. She told him on a morning in July, very early, before the sun was fully up, in the gray pre-dawn light of the bedroom with the farm sound starting outside, the birds and the far-off low of the cows, and she said it quietly and directly as she said everything. He had been sitting on the edge of the bed pulling on his boots, and he went still at her words, and then he set the boot down on the floor and turned to look at her, and her face in the dim light was careful, watching his response, not performing uncertainty but genuinely reading him. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. "Around February, I think." He moved to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her with something so large and so undisguised that she seemed surprised by it, which told him she had been bracing herself for a more complicated response, and he understood then that she was still sometimes waiting for the version of things that would hurt, the habit of someone who had lost people and knew loss was possible. "Alma," he said, "this is the best thing you have ever told me." She let out a breath that was not entirely steady. "I thought you would be pleased," she said, with a faint wobble in her usual composure that he found profoundly dear. "I thought you would, but I wasn't entirely certain." "I am considerably more than pleased," he said. She pressed her forehead to his, and they stayed like that for a long moment while the light came up outside and the farm woke around them. Their son was born in February of 1884, delivered by the midwife who served the Mercer community, a capable woman named Frances Teague, who had brought most of Mercer's current generation into the world. He was a healthy boy, born in the cold, early in the morning, and he made his presence felt with the kind of vigorous directness that Graham would later recognize as characteristic. They named him James, after Graham's father, which was both a simple and a complicated choice, and Alma held him in the gray morning light and looked at Graham across the child between them with an expression that Graham would carry inside him for the rest of his life, that particular amalgam of exhaustion and wonder and a love so uncomplicated by anything else that it was almost frightening in its purity. "James," Alma said, testing the name with the practical approach she brought to everything. "James Monroe." "Strong name," said Frances Teague from the foot of the bed, efficiently cleaning up. "He'll need one," Alma said. "He's already shouting about things." The first year of parenthood was, as it is for everyone, a comprehensive education in humility. James was a demanding infant, opinionated about feeding schedules and nap times and the quality of the lullabies offered to him, an opinion he communicated through volume. Graham, who was accustomed to controlling situations, discovered that a very small person was entirely capable of removing any illusion of control, and this was occasionally infuriating and more often hilarious, and Alma handled both his frustration and the baby's demands with a patience that impressed him enormously. He also became, to his own surprise, comprehensively besotted. He had expected to love his child. He had not expected the specific quality of it, the way James, at 8 weeks old, looked up at him with the unfocused concentration of an infant trying to make sense of the world, and how that unfocused gaze felt like the most important attention he had ever been given. Cole Briggs was released from Leavenworth in the spring of 1886, 2 months early for good behavior. He was 26 years old and he came to Mercer on the stage, and Alma met him in town with a wagon, and Graham came along because he had been corresponding with the man for 3 years and wanted to see who he had become. Cole Briggs, at 26, was different from the cornered and exhausted young man at the river. He was thinner, more deliberate in how he moved and how he spoke, with something careful in his eyes that had not been there before, a weighing of things before acting that the younger Cole had conspicuously lacked. He looked at Graham with a complex expression, and then he held out his hand and Graham shook it, and that was that. He looked at Alma and she looked at him, the two of them doing the wordless accounting of siblings who have been through something enormous, And then she put her arms around him and held on, and he let her. And over her shoulder his face was complicated with things that he did not have to name in public. Cole stayed in Mercer. He took work at Garrett's farm operation, learned to work land properly, and after a year of this rented a quarter section of his own. He was good at it. He was patient now in a way he had not been before, and patience was the primary quality the land required. In the spring of 1887, Alma told Graham she was pregnant again. This time she told him in the kitchen, over breakfast, with the same directness she used for everything, and he laughed, a spontaneous and delighted sound that he was not expecting from himself. And James, who was 3 years old and sitting between them eating biscuit and jam with the focused intensity of a person for whom breakfast is a serious occupation, looked up at his father's laughter with an expression of mild offense. "A brother or sister," Alma said, and she was already smiling, not waiting for his response this time, already there herself. "A brother," Graham said, with no basis for this assertion. "You don't know that," Alma said. "No," he agreed, "but I think so." "You thought wrong," she said, 9 months later, looking at the dark-haired infant daughter in her arms with an expression of enormous satisfaction. "Her name is Ruth." "Ruth Monroe," Graham said, looking at his daughter, and revised his theory immediately and completely, as he did whenever the evidence clearly demanded revision. "She's perfect." "She is," Alma agreed. "And she's going to run roughshod over both of us, I can already tell. Look at her brow." "She has your brow," Graham said. "Exactly," said Alma. Ruth Monroe did, in fact, have her mother's brow, and her mother's directness, and her father's stubbornness. And she made all of this clear from the earliest possible age. And James adored her with the uncomplicated generosity of a child who has enough and can therefore afford to share it. Cole found love of his own in 1888, a woman named Margaret Sloan, who had come to Mercer to teach at the small schoolhouse that the community had built the previous year. She was from Ohio, 25 years old, practical and warm with a dry sense of humor that matched Cole's own. And she knew his history because Alma had told her before anything could develop, because Alma believed in honesty as a foundation and not as an optional extra. Margaret had considered this for a week and then come to Alma and said that she had known men who had done bad things and men who had done bad things and come back from them, and that Cole Briggs appeared to be the second kind, and that she intended to proceed on that basis. Alma had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Good. He deserves that." Cole and Margaret were married in 1889, in the same small church where Graham and Alma had been married, and Graham stood with Cole just as Garrett had stood with Graham, and the community of Mercer turned out again with its particular prairie warmth. This small gathering of people who had chosen this place and built their lives in it with the stubbornness that all settlers shared. The years moved through Mercer with their seasonal authority, and Graham Monroe and Alma Baker moved through them together with the particular deep happiness of people who have found the thing they were looking for and recognized it clearly enough to hold on to it. It was not always uncomplicated. There were hard winters, including a brutal one in 1886 that tested every farm in the county and brought back in Graham the ghost of the Missouri failed farm and the Nebraska disaster. And he had to face that ghost honestly rather than letting it become a controlling anxiety. There was a summer of drought in 1888 that reduced their yield to almost nothing and required careful management of their reserves. And Alma dealt with this with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, doing the arithmetic, making the cuts, finding the additional income, and refusing to let the fear be larger than necessary. There was an ongoing injustice in the territory that Graham did not look away from, which was the treatment of the communities of color in and around the county. The Mexican families, who had been there longer than anyone and were regularly pushed toward the margins of civic life. The few remaining native people passing through who were treated as threats by their mere presence. The freedmen families who had come west after the Civil War seeking a fair chance and found instead that the prejudices had simply followed them to new geography. He used his position where he could. He made it clear that his protection extended to all residents of the county without exception. He responded to complaints from the Mendez family and the Robbins family, who were black homesteaders south of Mercer, with the same urgency he would have applied to any complaint. This made him unpopular with some people in the county, and he was not popular enough to be indifferent to this, but he was clear enough in his values to endure it. Alma supported him in this entirely. She was, if anything, more forthright about it than he was, having less need to maintain diplomatic relationships with the community. And she was friends with Rosa Mendez and with Constance Robbins in a way that was genuine and not performative, based on the simple recognition that these were women of intelligence and competence and character who happened to have been handed worse odds than she had. James Monroe grew up in Mercer with all of this as the texture of his daily life, which meant he grew up understanding certain things clearly that many children his age were taught to see obscurely. And he was a good boy, a serious and curious boy who loved the land and read everything he could get his hands on and asked questions that Graham sometimes couldn't fully answer, which he appreciated rather than being threatened by. Ruth Monroe grew up with all of it too, and what she made of it was a kind of fierce impatience with injustice that manifested early and often, and that Alma managed with the patient firmness of a woman who recognized in her daughter an intensified version of her own convictions. In 1890, Graham had a letter from Marshal Hicks in Abilene, now retired and living with his daughter's family. Hicks wrote to say that he had heard good things about what Graham had built in Mercer, and that he had been right to go, which was not a thing Hicks said easily, and Graham read this at the kitchen table with Alma sitting across from him and read her the relevant lines and watched her face do its quiet, pleased thing. High praise, she said. Extremely high for Hicks, Graham said. In 1892, Alma discovered she was pregnant a third time, and this time she told him in the barn because that was where they were, and they laughed together about the pattern of it, not in the kitchen, not in the bedroom, but always in the middle of some ordinary work, as if the news couldn't wait for a more dignified setting. Another boy, Graham said, in the same tone of complete unsubstantiated certainty he had used in 1887. I would like to point out, Alma said, that your prediction record is not good. It'll improve, he said. She looked at him with that particular expression that was half exasperation and half something that she was not going to let be called fondness but was entirely that. You are an infuriating man, she said. And yet, he said. And yet, she agreed and stepped into him, and he wrapped his arms around her there in the barn with the horses listening and the autumn smell of the hay all around them, and she said quietly into his chest, "We've built something good here, Graham." "We have," he said. "I want you to know I know that," she said. "I want you to know I don't take it for granted." He held her tighter. "Neither do I," he said, "not for a single day." It was a boy, born in the spring of 1893, and they named him George, and he came into the world with a placid disposition that was a considerable relief after the emphatic personalities of his older siblings. James was 9 years old and Ruth was 5, and George was deeply and immediately adored by both of them, and the farmhouse that had once held 1 and then 2 now held 5 plus Cole and Margaret next door and their own 2 children, a life that had grown out in all directions from the improbable seed of a trail that had ended at a woman's door. Graham Monroe turned 40 in the fall of 1893, and Alma turned 37, and they were, by every measure that mattered, deeply happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of people who had been spared difficulty. They had not been spared it, but the harder and more durable happiness of people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing, who had built a life with intention and attention, and who went asleep each night in a house that was full of the evidence of that sustained choosing. On the evening of Graham's birthday, after the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch in the October dark, the stars enormous over the prairie, The kind of night that the plains offered in autumn that was so clear and so vast it made you feel both very small and very precisely located, like knowing where you are on a map of enormous territory. "Do you think about what would have happened," Alma said, "if Cole had just given himself up in Dodge City? If there had been no chase, no trail, no you riding up to my door?" Graham thought about this. "Often," he said honestly. And I think about all the ways in which I might never have found this," he said. "All the directions I might have gone and the things I might have settled for and thought were enough because I didn't know what enough actually looked like." She was quiet for a moment. "I was frightened," she said. "That first night when you were standing on my porch, but not of you. I was frightened of myself, of what I was already noticing." He looked at her. "Already. You were on my doorstep with a gun at your head," she said dryly. "And you apologized for the hour. I thought, this is either the most ridiculous man I have ever encountered or the calmest. And then I thought, I want to know which." He laughed quietly in the October dark. "And both," she said, "as it turned out. Both at once." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I want to go on knowing which for a long time yet." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair. "So do I," he said. "So do I." The prairie around them was enormous and still, and the stars were out in their full autumn abundance, and the house behind them held their sleeping children, and somewhere north of them in a farmhouse Cole Briggs was a free man making a life, and the trail that had led here had been crooked and costly, and had passed through fear and violence and the terrible necessities of hard choices, and everything it had cost had been part of what it had found, and what it had found was this: the particular gravity of two people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of what choosing meant, and had not looked back from it. James Monroe grew up to study law at a college in Kansas City, inspired by his father's conversations about justice over kitchen table dinners that lasted until the oil in the lamp was almost gone. Ruth Monroe grew up to run the farm with her mother's fierce precision when both her parents grew older, and she married a steady and intelligent man from Mercer who was smart enough to recognize that being loved by Ruth Monroe was the great fortune of his life. George Monroe grew up with his father's patience and his mother's groundedness, and he worked the land, and he was good at it. Cole Briggs lived out his days in Mercer, a farmer and a husband and a father, a man who had made a catastrophic mistake at 22 and been given the chance to become something larger than his worst moment, and he did not waste it. He was known in Mercer as a decent man. People who came later and did not know his history would not have guessed it, which was not the erasure of accountability but the fulfillment of it. Graham Monroe served as Mercer's lawman for 17 years, until the county formalized its law enforcement structure in 1899, and he retired with the formal acknowledgement of the county commission, which was a dry civic ceremony that he found mildly embarrassing, and that Alma attended with the quiet pride she brought to all his accomplishments. In his retirement, he helped with the farm and read more, and rode out on Thursday mornings across the open range, the old habit, and he continued to have opinions about justice that he expressed at town meetings with the calm persistence of a man who had been making the same argument for decades, and intended to keep making it until it landed. Alma Baker Monroe continued to be the most direct and capable and fiercely intelligent person he had ever known. She continued to surprise him with her thoughts and her humor and her particular way of seeing things, well into their older years, and he continued to find this astonishing, not as a miracle, but as a daily confirmation of what he had understood on a November afternoon in a Kansas corral when he had said, "I want to know you for a very long time." He did know her for a very long time, and it was, by every honest accounting, enough. It was, by every honest accounting, everything. The trail had led him to her door. He had followed it without knowing what he was following toward, thinking he was tracking an outlaw and finding instead the woman who would become the organizing fact of his life. He had arrived at her door with bound hands and blood on his temple and a badge that had caught the lamplight, and she had cut the ropes and cleaned the wound and fed him and told him the truth, and he had ridden away and then ridden back, and he had never left again. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. He had left behind the marshals and the trail and the solitary vigilance and the hotel rooms and the particular loneliness that had gotten used to itself. And he had stayed in a farmhouse on the Kansas prairie with a woman who was everything he had not known to ask for, and the staying was the bravest thing he had ever done and the best. On a warm evening in June many years after the autumn of 1882, Graham Monroe sat on the porch of the farmhouse with Alma beside him, both of them older now, the gray in her hair the color of prairie sage in winter, beautiful and uncompromising, his own face mapped with years of sun and wind, and the particular deep lines of a man who has spent a long time looking at things clearly. The grandchildren were in the yard, loud and various, their voices carrying across the golden evening air, and Cole and Margaret were coming up the track from their farm next door for supper, and the kitchen smelled of whatever Alma had been preparing since that afternoon, and the sky over the Kansas prairie was doing its extravagant sunset thing, as it had done every evening of every year that Graham Monroe had lived here, as it would go on doing long after. And he sat in it with the woman who had made him brave enough to stay. She reached over and took his hand without looking at him, the gesture so practiced and so natural it had become the same as breathing, and he held hers back, and that was all, and it was sufficient and full and more than either of them had known to ask for in those younger days when asking had still seemed presumptuous. A trail had led here. An outlaw had run, and a lawman had followed, and the following had led not to a neat conclusion but to an open beginning, and the beginning had grown into this. A life built in layers and intentions, and the accumulated ordinary moments of two people choosing the same direction. It had been, Graham Monroe thought in the evening light, an extraordinary good fortune to have been sent after Cole Briggs, and Alma, who could read him as easily as she read her land, turned and looked at him and said, "I know," and smiled her full smile, the one without moderation, the one that had rearranged him the first time he saw it and went on rearranging him still. "I know," she said again. "So do I." The Kansas sky blazed, and the children shouted in the yard, and Cole Briggs came up the track with his wife, and the supper waited inside, and the world was, in this moment, and for all the moments that had accumulated into it, exactly right.